Hello, and welcome to this course on professional ethics. My name's Christopher Britton, and I will be your instructor for better or for worse this coming term. Actually, I'm quite looking forward to it. And looking forward to meeting you in person, but I thought this video would be at least a way for you to get a sense of me to some degree and what we're in store for this course. I'm not going to walk you through the syllabus today. Please do have a look. And you'll note there are 4 readings, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But what I thought I would do in this short video is first give you a little sense about myself, a brief introduction to professional ethics. The readings I think will be useful, so I don't want to repeat those, and then some opening remarks on this week's readings. So let's proceed with that. Myself, I've just arrived in Toronto, so I'm settling into a new job, very busy one, so apologies you're only getting this video today, but I'll get ahead of the game once things get moving. I'm a graduate, actually, of Trinity College. I did my PhD here at the University of Toronto. Since then, I've been ordained an Anglican minister for 21 years. I've taught theology in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Atlantic School of Theology, ecumenical institution. In Aberdeen, Scotland, where I worked for 11 years and just moved to Toronto from here. While in Europe, I also taught occasionally at the University of Vienna in the theology department there. And now here at Trinity College, where I am the Dean of Divinity and the Margaret E. Fleck Chair in Anglican Studies. For my PhD, I studied systematic theology and ethics, but I've also done a lot of teaching in what we call practical theology in the United Kingdom, so issues to challenges in ministry, and done a lot of qualitative research as well in ministry contexts. I'm married. I don't have children of my own, but this year I have a 15-year-old godchild living with us who's doing an exchange year from Germany. So that's been an interesting adjustments for us all as school has begun. You'll get to know me a little better as we carry on, and when we meet in person in October. So let's proceed now to just talk a little bit about professional ethics. You'll have some thoughts about what this word means already, this concept, and the readings will indicate this week that it's a contested term. It attends, of course, to the ways in which moral and ethical situations arise in the work of ministry and in any work environment, and it develops strategies, habits, and ways of being that help one navigate such challenges. I'll just give you 2 brief examples from my own ministry settings. The first is from a clinical setting in a hospital where I was doing chaplaincy training. I went to one noon-hour topics and issues roundtable discussion. It was just an informal discussion as we ate our lunch. And that day, an ICU doctor came, and it was his turn to just share some thoughts about this topic in general. He wasn't a specialist in professional ethics by any means, or medical ethics, but he came because he wanted to talk about his discomfort over experiences where he was treating 2 patients in different rooms that were right next to each other. The first patient was dying, and there was no question of recovery. And so his job, of course, was to prolong his life as much as he could, ease his discomfort and suffering, and help see the patient through this process. Next door, also his patient, was someone desperately waiting for an organ transplant. And the doctor happened to know that the first patient, the one who was dying, may well have the organ, might be a match to the second patient. And so in this conversation, at the round table, he was saying, how do I know I'm giving both patients the best treatment possible? It's particularly the first patient. Will my desire to help save the life of patient number 2 influence the decisions I make over whether or not I struggle to keep patient number 1 alive? It was interesting to observe one of a more senior, the reaction to this presentation, a more senior doctor in the room said, well, I don't see a problem here. To which the man who made the presentation said, well, what do you mean? I mean, this does seem to be a moral issue, an ethical dilemma to me. And I'm not sure we have the procedures or structures, or at least self-understanding, to think clearly through this situation. And the doctor said, you're trained professional, you use common sense, you'll figure it out. But here I would think that I'm not convinced that that's an adequate answer. I think that first doctor was on to something. It's not that he is likely to make a huge mistake and so on, but he was just saying, look, he's got contrasting, conflicting commitments, and he just thought it would be useful to think through such situations, establish some guidelines or some procedures that would help avoid bad decisions being made. And that seems to me to be the work of professional ethics. Second situation is from when I was working on a ministry team in a church context. We were doing a church plant, and there were 4 of us on the team, and one morning, one woman who was on to preach and do some other tasks simply didn't show up. When we confronted her later in the week about why she hadn't showed up, her reply was, God told me that I needed to stay in bed this morning. To which, of course, we asked, well, did God tell you to call the rest of the team to tell us that? So there's one issue of how she comported herself in the situation, but it brings to mind also a challenge that one of our texts asked this week in our readings, is the challenge between balancing one's own self-care, one's own self-interest, and the expectations and duties one has in one's professional role. And how do we think through those matters? So I'll leave those two with you just to give a sense of why the very discipline of professional ethics has developed in many spheres of contemporary institutional life, why it's also an issue in ministry, practice of ministry, whatever sort of context you're working in, and how merely holding to notions of, well, we're mature, we've got a degree, we will use common sense, are frequently proven to be quite inadequate and unfounded as ways to guide busy, complicated, professional activity in our time. I'll turn now to our readings. We have 4 of them this week, which may feel daunting. A couple of them are not very long at all. I also don't think you'll find them very difficult to understand. They're not horribly technical. They are relatively introductory, and I think you'll find them certainly informative and I hope engaging to some degree. I'll just walk you through them very briefly. The first, we have an article by Beckett and Maynard, The Professional Context. And you'll know from the outset, these are not theologians or pastors. They're not speaking about a ministry context. They focus on the issue of boundaries, particular behavior is important, how particular behavior is appropriate in certain contexts, how professionals are called not just to be themselves, which I think is probably useful actually when we discuss ministry, because one does often hear advice given to pastors, just be yourself. Why might that not be adequate as advice? And also the necessity of dealing with employer expectations and standard. The authors are focused on the context of social work. And I thought that'd be useful for 2 reasons. One is a number of you are not working in congregations, I understand, so more in institutional settings, so there might be some resonance between the discussion in this chapter and the way they approach it. The second is because I think it's helpful to have a contrast as we think about ministry in particular. Well, is it distinct in some ways from other helping professions? And if so, how? What are the resonances with other helping professions, and what are the differences? And so I thought this would help stimulate some thinking along those lines. This reading has a number of different exercises. It encourages you to do a little reflection on some situations or some principles, and sometimes it contrasts social work with law or medicine, for example. I encourage you to reflect on these. Take the time to just pause and think about it um, from the perspective of your own professional context. What is particular and unique about your ministry setting, and what's similar to how these authors discuss the situation for social workers? Our second reading is by Wiest and Smith, The Professional Character. Although it's from 1990, it's still it's a classic text in Christian professional ethics, and so I include it because of that fact. It's been with us for quite some time, but in particular because of this chapter's focus on the concept of vocation. The issue of character, the character of individuals, of the moral actor, rather than a list of skills or a list of rules to follow, but one's character, how one comports oneself, one's habits, and so on, has become a very prominent theme in contemporary Christian ethics, and we'll talk about that later in the course. Other authors make a lot more of that concept than this chapter does, Wiest and Smith, but I think what they say here does resonate with it to some degree. And we'll get more of that when you encounter Walter Fluker's book later in the course that takes up this theme. Our third article, Troll and Carter, from a more recent book on professional ethics, I'm asking you to read in its entirety, or at least most of it, as much as you can. This chapter, though, is called The Minister's Vocation. And eventually you'll write a book review on this in a few weeks, so I trust you'll attend to this chapter carefully. It describes a tendency to get lost in the midst of our busy professional lives, for which they employ the metaphor of agnosia. This can generate, they say, anomie, which they take from a prominent Christian ethicist, Gustafson, the loss of clear, delineated boundaries of authority, which causes all kinds of confusion of roles and so on. In response, Troll and Carter emphasize the concept of integrity and calling. So focus on what they mean by those concepts in particular this week. And I think there's also a useful discussion by the authors between distinguishing between vocation, profession, and career. And they talk about the problems of careerism and so on, which of course can also occur in ministry. But just to get a sense of how they think about profession and vocation in relation to that. I also appreciate the author's suggestion that their critique of the suggestion, just to be clear, that ministry is not a profession. They think it is, but it's not uncommon to encounter this suggestion that ministry is not a profession. So curious to know what you think about their response to that suggestion. Finally, the fourth article by Bob Brecker, The Politics of Professional Ethics, is also not from the realm of theology, but again, I think it's useful to step back sometimes from our own context and see whether issues that resonate for others in other contexts might be relevant and push us to consider things from a different perspective in our own professional lives. It begins to pick up themes that I want to explore later in the course. So it's just an introduction here, not so much the focus of our conversation, maybe this week and also next week. But opens with a concern about the use of just war theory. So what rational arguments used to justify the use of deadly force to change behavior, defend innocent victims, and so on. Long tradition in Western thought, just war theory. He's concerned that, however, that sometimes just war theory is used to justify immoral conduct. So we're following the rules of just war theory, and yet what we're doing, he thinks sometimes is completely unjustifiable. He uses this example to get to which really his point. It's not about just war theory. It's about the notion that sometimes ethical standards, ethical rules, get reduced to mere guidelines that people follow while assuming that if they follow these rules, it gets them off the hook from being concerned about any additional moral concerns. He's also concerned about how some ethical standard codes sometimes get abused when people learn how to, quote unquote, play the system. And so he's nervous about the politics around professional ethics, and I think that's something we should at least reflect on before we complete this course. His main question is this: does the concept of professional ethics and codes of conduct risk merely institutionalizing the status quo? So these codes keep us from running into problems that will shut us down, but they're not necessarily helping us be more moral in all situations. So we'll debate these issues later on in the course, and there's one possible discussion question you might pick up on this. So this week, how we'll proceed is, in usual weeks, I will post some questions for discussion, and I would like you to please try to answer those by Wednesday, because I would like each of you to read the answers written by your colleagues and answer one question from two different people. All right, so that's read the questions. You don't have to answer everything, and you can answer more than that if you want. But read the questions from your colleague, the responses from your colleagues, and write 2 emails responding to 2 different individuals. I hope that's clear enough. I hope you're looking forward to the course. Please be in touch if you have questions, and I'll be engaging with you by email over the course of the week once you start to respond to the questions of discussion. All the best. Bye for now.